this evening. Mark Pimlott and Tony Fretton, longtime friends, collaborators, I should say at the outset, graduates of this fine old school, have known the place for many years and launched careers many years ago in this city and in events like this in this building, for the first time in many years to present their recent works and unfolding conversation around many shared interests related to architecture, its territories, interiors, the way in which the architectural object, the interior, and its larger field is represented in architecture. And you're going to find examples of both in each of tonight's presentations. I just asked for a brief summary of how we've choreographed the evening, and it's a very simple setup to say Mark is going first and Tony will be second. And with that, I think open up a conversation that maybe can carry on after each of their presentations this evening. And formally speaking, tonight is an opportunity really to celebrate a recent publication of Tony's. And Tony and I were speaking sometime in the last year and invited him in to present his monograph, which will be in the back in the North Jury Room here off of this space for sale afterwards, but which is really a summary of 30 remarkable years of work in his studio, which will include projects that are the kind of collaborative form that you'll see that the guys will be speaking about tonight. They've done shared work together. I think most recently that I could think of in 2000 would have been the 2010 Venice Architecture Biennale collaborated together on an installation which touches on many of the themes and topics of tonight's presentations. Both immensely talented, of course, and renowned designers and architects. They are also educators, longtime educators, in fact, with a deep interest in the relationship between teaching and practice, which you will see explored in many different ways in which they'll be presenting tonight. Mark's lecture will open on the topic, as he said, of representation strictly in the relationship of interiors and territories in his practice, and the way in which recent installation projects especially have touched on that. Tony's lecture is titled Buildings and Their Territories, which is in fact the title of his monograph recently released by Birkhauser, and especially some of the recent projects of his London-based studio. Both have been longtime teachers at Delft University in the Netherlands. Tony has recently stepped away from that role and returned to teaching here in the UK. Mark carries that forward and is doing so this year. Both have, of course, completed many award-winning projects in both the art and architecture worlds, work that has been exhibited and published extensively around the world. Mark most recently, in 2010, published a collection of photographs. We might see some of those in tonight's presentation. Small publication titled In Passing. 3 years before that, in 2007, Without and Within was a wonderful collection of his essays and writing on the topic, particularly of the interior and architecture. And as I said earlier, Tony's 2013 publication, Buildings and Their Territories, summarizes the work of his London-based studio, which has completed many projects that I'm sure many people here know and know well, from the Listen Gallery to what I reckon might be London's most remarkable house these days, a house for the Kapoor family, his Warsaw Embassy, and many others. Please join me in welcoming both Mark and Tony, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark Pimlott for tonight's first presentation.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Brett, and it's very nice to be here and to see so many people. It has been quite some time since I spoke here, last occasion being indeed a talk on the relationship between the territorialization of the American continent with its effective interiorization and the development of a condition of interiority and those spaces that we're all too familiar with, that one might place under the category of the continuous interior. I mention this because much of my sensibility on an evening in which one is talking about shared sensibilities, and I think the talk tonight will which will be brief, and I've got a text which I'll stick to so I don't run over time, really concerns the development of a position and how that position is generated through one's own volition and through relationship. In this case, the relationship with Tony, which has been remarkably fertile over a very, very long period of time. But my sensibility was forged in the hopeful, almost utopian environment of 1960s Montreal, which provided a coherent image to the North American project of interiorization, one which was, thankfully, compelling and open to interpretation, my own, as opposed to the numbing interior environments produced throughout the technologized world by global capitalism. The environments in which I was conditioned offered a place in the world in which it was possible to imagine personal liberty, disconnected from consumption and ideology. I know that sounds like a paradox, but it was how I interpreted it. My heightened appreciation of the potential of this environment from an early age, inspired by the unique condition of Montreal's development at that time. It was a city that was also fascinating for, amongst others, Rainer Banham, led me to my approaches to work that have sustained me from the days of being a student here at the AA. I studied under Rodrigo Perez de Arce, to my work in teaching, designing, making art, and writing up until the present. And furthermore, in my collaboration with others, other artists, architects, engineers. My long friendship and artistic and intellectual engagement with Tony Fretton has been very important for key articulations of my own position. And since this evening is billed as shared sensibilities, I thought it was useful to go over a story of some key moments in the making or clarification of my own sensibility. The Architectural Association has a way of bringing people together, which perhaps it's not even conscious of. It makes culture happen. Rodrigo Perez de Arce's great teaching educated me and helped me focus my dawning politicization to find key parts of my own artistic position. This is from my graduation project. After my fourth year, Rodrigo recommended me to Jeremy and Fenella Dixon for summer work, where I continued to work after my graduation and found other aspects of my voice. There, I met Peter St. John, and we started to work together, of Caruso St. John, on projects of our own. In 1986, we designed an enormous cultural center for a competition in India, which won a prize and was exhibited in an outrageous display in the bar, I think commemorated in AA files, a photograph of Cedric Price looking alarmed at the installation. This, of course, drew some attention, this scheme. This is also from the scheme, and probably led to my meeting Tony. Tony had generously asked Peter to design a loft for a client of his, the electronic music producer Daniel Miller. Peter asked me if I would work with him, and when we all got together to discuss the project, I mentioned that it would be teaching a new unit here at the AA and the intermediate school, which had been very kindly and perhaps foolishly offered to me by Alvin Boyarsky. And at that moment, Tony asked if he could teach with me. There was no obvious reason why this collaboration should have worked. It was serendipitous, but it did for many years. It became clear to Peter, as Peter and I worked on this design for the loft, I think I have another picture of it here, and as we taught, that that our sensibilities, and I refer to Tony and my sensibilities, were complementary and quite different from those Peter and I shared. In my earlier work, I was interested in revealing, and I'm going to have to go backwards for this, as typically I have to go backwards. I'll go back to Barcelona all the way back then. I was interested in revealing unconscious aspects or fictions of the city. Buildings would act as agents for making these aspects visible and for reconciling the ideas or fictions realized in buildings in cities in different times over different historical periods. My graduation project in Barceloneta in 1985 imagined the city's edge as a kind of ruin, continuously occupied. Later, the competition developed for Delhi in 1986, so that's Bordeaux, imagined a cultural complex made as though assembled over a very long time, and a rooftop landscape correspondingly looked out over a city that had been made over 2,000 years. Later, and I have to go backwards for this, for a project for an imaginary Baudelaire Chateau in Pauillac, I posited a dreamlike composition of fragments and half-made elements, as though they were made at different moments in time, through different paradigms, set in an ambiguous floodplain landscape. When I came to work with Peter, under the eye of Tony, we felt obliged to commit ourselves to a position, finally. We were not speculating, but making what seemed to be a political statement. The subject of this statement, the loft, was set in what at the time was a strange part of Bermondsey, with council blocks, garages, storerooms, workshops, and the railway viaduct into London Bridge. Peter and I thought that the huge interior should somehow be continuous with its environment, that its features should be extensions of those outside, and should make one conscious of the features of its setting, from the scale of the city to the scale of the artifact. The artifacts in the loft borrowed from the appearances of ordinary things in the neighborhood and filtered them through a measure of pictorialization or representation. Tony referred to this as form making, and it was true that we wanted to make forms. I particularly wanted to set forth a more far-reaching position regarding what we make and the connectedness of things. This was an outlet for an attitude which I had been aware of from a very young age, raised in the territorialized urban environment of a Montreal suburb, where it seemed clear to me that everything was part of one place, connecting other places, people, and times. But it seemed that the form-making I was interested in was one in which other things would be part of the identity of the thing designed, that incompleteness, interdependence, contingency, and weakness were essential aspects of this. Furthermore, I thought that architecture's representational character could reveal the hidden representational character of everything else, that the ordinary could be revealed as being a concatenation of fictions, that if only attended to closely, could reveal essential things about ourselves. There was no question that this position was arrived at under the influence of Tony about teaching. By the way, this is a competition project done with Peter and I, which I'll refer to again in a moment, hopefully. As Tony and I talked together, we talked. We talked about a cultural landscape of music, art, architecture, and London. The talk about music drew the artistry of diverse, I'll go back a bit, diverse makers together. We talked about Thelonious Monk or Bela Bartok, Iggy Pop, and so on. The talk about art centered on minimal and conceptual art, particularly that of Sol LeWitt, Robert Morris, and Dan Graham, work that pertained to the acts of conceiving and making, kind of performance. The talk about architecture concerned Caesar, Leibowitz, but mostly the ordinary and forgotten 1960s architecture of the West End, which we explored by night. That work, plain and utopian, found itself looked at in the same way as we looked at taxi dispatch booths, shops, and other supposedly invisible assemblages of the city, and their unconsciously arrived at beauty. Tony was designing the Liston Gallery at the time, and I was going through a phase where I believed my thoughts would be more directly realized by making art. We looked at a lot of art spaces, and we traveled looking at art spaces, finding places for students to do projects, meeting colleagues, seeing architecture we thought was more eloquent about our space in the world than anything around us. Architecture we wanted to emulate. I'll see if I can catch up with the slides here and say anything. This is a project for Tokyo that I did with Peter St. John, which I'll come to in a moment. we went to the various edges that were either literally at the edges or at the center of Europe, where things seemed to be particularly visible. Prague, Porto, Köln, Wuppertal, Marseille, Flims, Basel, Stockholm, and other places. The walking, talking, and looking here and in all these elsewheres seemed to sharpen our attitudes, particularly my own. Tony will probably say his attitudes were sharpened too, which became fixed in a kind of topographic photography, somewhere between the traditions of the 19th century surveys and the snapshots. Maybe I have to go on with the slides a bit. Sorry about this. This is a photograph. Yes, it's slightly mixed slides. This is always happening. Walking, talking. Okay, it's London. Porto. Wuppertal. Porto again. Porto. Brno. Stockholm. Stockholm. So the photographs drew the various appearances of many places together, making everything visible in one place. The photographs amplified aspects of our discussions about architecture. We had particularly fixed on a discussion between Lynn Cook and the sculptor Tony Cragg, who, in reference to his works made of reclaimed materials, particularly plastic detritus, he said that all products of society were legitimate and that all must be considered. This opened up our way of seeing many things too, and deepened our appreciation for, as an example, Alvaro Siza and his seeing works of architecture that spoke of the very broad context for architectural and cultural production, of what architecture and what cities were made of. It was not clear that we could actually design together, however. We seemed too independent for that. Yet we made a project together for Montreal, for Place Chartier, the sloping market square of the old city that connected City Hall to the old harbour. The project followed the tenor of our walks and conversations and their hopes for setting scenes in which people would feel radically more conscious of their place in the world. In the case of Montreal, we made a clearing, sloped on all sides, resembling the profile of the city streets, and made of the material upon which the city was built. The city was full of empty lots, and and one could walk through the downtown core absent-mindedly, past parked cars, across scrublands and ordinary streets. We thought that this project could evoke this unconsciously experienced city, the greater landscape, and through its haptic suggestiveness, sharpen one's sense of being in the world. This strategy seemed to me to reiterate the character of my own photographic attention, to which I'll return. At the same moment, I was also working on a competition project for Tokyo, where that slide should have been, I'm very sorry, with Peter, which was an enormous thing, to which we responded by making silent behemoths of white glass and black brick with a huge proscenium-like hole through which one could look at the city building itself and tearing itself down, an equivalent in my mind of the proscenium of Karl Friedrich Schinkel's project for the Schauspielhaus in Berlin, which pictured an ideal Berlin. We also made a hypothetical project for Baron's Court for an exhibition here at the AA with Matthias Sauerbuch and Louise Hutton, Robert Mull and Katrina Beaver, Don Bates and Tony Fretton. Tony there, right? This was in 1990, by the way, which proposed a Mesian roof. It was the pink and yellow slide, which you might recall or not, which was hovered over a large area that would provide shelter for station passengers and a frame for viewing the myriad conditions surrounding and engulfing the station. But something was happening to me at that time. I came to think that these ideas were pictures that had to be made more quickly, that my thoughts would be better served by making something more direct than architecture. And I found I was looking at engaging with art with far more sympathy than I was engaging with architecture. It's a characteristic which was true of my graduation project as well, which made Rodrigo terribly nervous, particularly coming up to the time of the diploma reviews. And so I perhaps made the rather foolish decision to leave architectural making in favor of art making. I made sculpture that looked at once like ordinary things and pictures of things. I arranged these things as though they were meant to be useful equipment for some fictional yet plausible world. I wanted to make things that through their status as representations, as pictures of themselves, caused one to pause before them and thereafter before all objects in the environment. This was another outlet for my thoughts regarding the contingency of all things, which in turn became more focused in photographs, installations, and finally more literally articulated in texts, and then films and their spoken narrations. These sculptures were partial reconstructions of half-remembered objects and photographic representations of real artifacts, and real scenes. The photographs were and continue to be made of places, clearings, and artifacts that seem to bear ideas of elsewhere within them. The installations proposed, so I'll go through the photographs first. These are in Poland. This is a housing block called Manhattan in Łódź. An interior of a house whose window looks onto an island in a lake, which looks like a picture of an island in a lake or a screen. The interior of my own childhood home. And so on. This is the characteristics of the photographs that, in a way, I found very allied to 19th century topographic photography. I'll carry on, and I'll finish this. Sorry. I should do this more slowly. Because I'm going to the installations now. I'm sorry about this. This is what happens with a last-minute change. The installations proposed that each artifact or picture depended on the conditions of its own visibility, and that each artifact was furthermore dependent on the existence of other artifacts or pictures for their existence. Each element was weak, completed by all the other elements. The installation Studiolo became a model for work that finally returned to address streets and places in cities, first in film and then in permanent works for places and interiors. This is from the installation Studiolo, where you see the pictures or the items are actually dependent on each other for their existence. In a way, they refer to other objects. They don't stay within themselves. And they're also dependent on the architectural framework, which is constantly called into question as a fiction in its own right. The films were largely concerned with the utopian project, with hope and disillusionment. In short, there were stories about the environment in which I was raised, which were embodied in the streets of European metropolitan centers, the cities of modernity, and could be read. In the films and the photographs that I made, I worked with the view that meaning was embedded in things, and that things were inevitably representations of ideas, even if they were intended to be transparent in their function. These ideas did not come out of nothing, but from some original encounters with the world and with others. Two powerful models were useful to me: the making and foundation rights of the colonial settlement, and the idea of attention as exemplified in the photographic works of Timothy O'Sullivan, working on the great surveys of the American West in the 1860s. In making real places, I was obliged to think that things and places are made in the world at the cusp or threshold of what is known and what is not known, at clearings where the self can approach and meet the other. An attention, like the photographic attention exemplified in O'Sullivan's practice, might serve to bind the work and its users to the world. So this attitude of attention, which I offer here as a model to begin the architectural project, comes with complexities when it concerns the world we have made. As in facial expressions or those of speech, the features of our places, buildings, and interiors are utterances or representations, and so are incomplete or inadequate expressions of meaning, regardless of their sophistication. A room is at once itself and a representation of an idea, such as memories of another room, or in fact many other rooms. Similarly, a place is at once itself and a trace of many overlapping traces of elsewhere, is made from the material and properties that have accumulated over time, with contributions of many periods and the ideas of each, a jumble of representations, a cacophony of utterances of varying currency and coherence concerning ideas of what the place is, what it must fulfill, what it wants to be, and what it has wanted to be in the past. It is impossible, I think, to avoid association and memory. It is impossible to avoid the loss that comes with that, and the sense of separation from something that was at one time recognizable, clear, and fundamental. The idea that things are at once themselves and representation of the idea of themselves infiltrates my work. I should note that my practice continues to be one that mixes the design of places with the design of interiors. And the design of places often takes place in the context of an art proposition rather than an architectural proposition. There is in my mind, in attending to the environment that displays the overlapping accumulation of things, an idea, and this idea of the concatenation of representations, each striving for a kind of transparency or ideal. At the root of this chain of expressions, there is an original utterance that speaks of being in the world, such as can be found in the origin of places. So this is the fiction as I operate, as I work, or as I look, as I think of other places, other people, and other times, and as I try to interpret the connections and continuity between them all. And this is a juncture one always arrives at in turning from attention to making. The matter of making is one of recognizing that one's utterance is placed amidst all the others that have gone before and all the others that will come after. Perhaps this kind of attention is difficult to sustain in architectural practice. And so my work making real places came about as possibilities in the world of art rather than the world of architecture, and therefore they were released from the obligation to instrumentality to which architecture is often burdened. This first existing place was added to with that kind of attention that is characteristic of my own approach to photography. It's in Wales, on an elevated square at a university campus, surrounded by concrete buildings built in the 1960s, gathered to produce something like an urban setting for student life in the image of an Italian piazza overlooking the town below and the landscape and sea beyond. Its image, the original image, was incomplete, unfocused. The buildings around the piazza were hardly Italianate, despite their quasi-civic functions and their names. A boiler flue, which you see on the left, was called the Campanile. There were brutalist buildings all around, influenced by Le Corbusier, made in concrete and bronze-tinted glass. The message of a democratic space founded on the spirit of the ancients was powerful to me, however, despite being half-uttered, and one I wanted to extend in order that its idea, its generosity, nobility, and humanity might articulate itself more clearly. It was clear that this place suffered from a problem that we have in our culture in Britain, namely that we refuse to take responsibility for our ideas, and that we reject what we have made as though it has been done by something or someone else. The adversarial tradition of our parliament, our judiciary, and our discourse serves some things very well indeed, but it creates a condition in which blame can be placed on some imagined other, and one's own responsibility can be abrogated. The Smithsons spoke of this with some force in their observations on vandalism and disrespect for the urban environment in London at the time of their work on Robin Hood Gardens. They remarked that European colleagues were appalled by the complete lack of self-respect that was embedded in that vandalism and squalor. So my position regarding the reconciliation of time was paramount here in this project, insisting that this 60s place was a product of a generous idea that people had enthusiastically subscribed to, as opposed to being put upon, to accept. My strategy was therefore to extend and intensify the idea and its outlet in a particular language of form. I added a loosely placed, as you can see by now clearly, loosely placed freestanding monumental tribune whose reverse face also acted as kind of loggia set apart for an existing stair cut into the piazza, which is just where this desk is sitting right here. And the town, it led to the town, the sea, and the horizon. It was a place for people to sit and look at the view and each other against the ancient setting of the land. I called it La Scala and made it a board marked in situ concrete and precast concrete, just like the buildings around the piazza. And so it simply joined. By the way, they called it the piazza. This is not a name that I imposed upon it. That was how this place was commonly known. So the idea was already there. It just needed to be realized. And so this thing just simply extended the fiction of the scene. There were, of course, many other works which I will just not describe today, but it is this one through which I understood the importance of allowing the scene to be. But here I come back to those sensibilities shared with Tony, from which I seem to have drifted. Indeed, each of us had our own ways and our own concerns in work, but these, I think, as Tony thought when we met, complemented each other. And so it was an act of great generosity that Tony asked me to work on the interior of the Red House, which I looked at as the representation of a set of ideas that were deeply embedded in his project for the house and for architecture. The house is a palace made of several other palaces, each with their own idea, their own nature. My work to the house was really the intensification of its ideas, its memories of other architectures, and its greater idea of creating realms of peace and pleasure for its inhabitants. There is the natural suggestion of luxury in this house which goes beyond its facades, which comes from the sequence and disposition of its volumes, from the small garden courtyard directly off the street, screened from it by frosted glass, to the unfolding of a route directly to the garden through glass doors. A garden house, it would seem, on the ground. But one passes through this double height of the palazzo along the way, as you just saw the room with the staircase in it, to a set of rooms nestled in a dense garden, to finally a glass pavilion completely surrounded by it. The ceiling of the pavilion is a painted woven cloth suspended over the room, as though it was just being set for some sort of informal picnic. The palazzo resolves itself on the piano nobile with an almost cubic room that seems to occupy the entire plan. Its ceiling, intended to be seen from the street, is again conceived as a billowing fabric, this time out of plaster, to suggest a volume of air. Small episodes appear in the corners and almost invisible and private parts of the house of extreme luxury, which I'm not showing here. They are intended to be solely for the viewing of the owners. A small apartment between the piano nobile and the penthouse runs between the street and the garden on the two sides like some long Zurich apartment. And on top, there is an extensive penthouse organized around a garden which has changed over the years, which accommodates rooms of great comfort, sensuousness, and nobility, which, in a way, have undergone all sorts of alterations to perhaps accommodate changes to the life of the occupant. But in these spaces, what I've tried to do is not only intensify Tony's objectives, but to find those or encourage those very private parts of the individuals who occupy the house and their sense of and their need for succor through a kind of visual, material, and sensual luxury. Tony and I were invited by, oh my God, I'm running over time. Tony and I were invited by Kazuyo Sejima to make an installation together for the Venice Biennale in 2010 in the Corderie dell'Arsenale. Our idea was simple: to put together an installation that was a real place. Sounds like a contradiction. It is, in which strains of thought developed in each of our own practices regarding the spaces of an architecture and the senses of the world would be somehow intertwined. We felt that each of us had produced a repertory of spaces, figures, and forms, or motifs that, when fused, could suggest a place that would be both urban and interior in character. The meeting between a salone grande and a piazza. The installations assembled pieces, spaces, and objects that we had worked with independently over for years, and proposed an interior that fused this salone in piazza into a Piazzasalone, where people could actually meet, however briefly, and think about their relations to each other. Objects were placed next to each other in a sequence that unfolded and suggested at first a piazza, a street, a monumental interior, a storehouse, a salon, and the private space of a desk and a mirror. The figures of the room that appeared in the room were stripped down models of previous works at inconsistent scales and therefore almost toy-like, models indeed. The real artifacts in the space, festoon lights, a wooden font, and a 1970 Alfa Romeo were set among the model of La Scala, which you see here, the Listen Gallery, which you saw earlier, the Red House, the Tietgens Ayrton building in Copenhagen, Tony's desk for the series Architecture as a Performing Art, and various versions of my paintings from the Studiolo installation as props in an intentionally ludic scene. I want to conclude with another scene developed over the time of the original design of the Red House interiors, all the way to the installation in Venice, so it's sort of a 10-year period. World, which is a public place in the middle of the BBC. That's Broadcasting House, new and old, surrounding it. It slips under Broadcasting House and extends from Langham Street to Langham Place. My intention was to make a place in which people would be conscious of themselves, of others around them, and a world of others beyond them. By its simple form, an interrupted circle, it connects the buildings of the BBC's Broadcasting House to each other, of course, and to the streets of London. The surface of granite flags describes an imaginary globe, marked with lines reminiscent of those of longitude and latitude, and names of places, many places. The lines, of course, are just a key. They're not meant to be literal, but just a key that suggests that this is supposed to be some elsewhere that you fly over. There are speakers set into the ground, quietly playing different language broadcasts of the BBC World Service live. Lights scattered across the surface are intended to suggest human habitats as they might be seen by night or from high above in a flight of one's imagination, or even a pathway of stars. I intended that these names, voices, and lights of world should evoke our world, its people, and its history. The selection of names were informed by my own experience, memory, and knowledge. The places named are infamous and famous, renowned and obscure. They are scenes of leisure and labor, beauty and catastrophe, enlightenment and barbarism. They are the sites of the origins of habitation, civilization, and belief. Of course, there's no geological accuracy in the positioning of names. Rather, they are placed on the principle that on being read next to each other as one walks along, various images, connections, and poetry will naturally and inevitably arise, a principle that relies on association, alliteration, and accident for its effects. As names are read aloud by a strolling viewer, their sounds create a litany that, like some imaginary shipping forecast, rouses thoughts of elsewheres and the mysteries of other people, other places, and other times. I think world is representative in a sense of my practice in that it is a modest project of reconciliation which would seem to return us and me to a state of some sort of idealistic consciousness, the consciousness of one's tender youth. Thanks very much.
I'm not going to say anything for half an hour. Or maybe I will. Okay. In truly disorganized fashion, we didn't talk about our presentation, so all the way through what you were saying, I had to figure out how I was going to link what I'd done to what you just said. So I think there's two things. Firstly, that we're both interested in objects as cultural artifacts. Now that's a very particular position as an architect, because it means that what one sees, both in the sense of the objects that you make and the things which you draw on, the physical things that you draw on, are made by other people. I mean, usually architects either design according to some half-remembered style or according to some unquestioned whim, you know. But actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to articulate value systems in the material that we use which are more social and which have broader values. And sometimes, for example, in the case of the Listen Gallery, which views of the city which simply say, this is what London's done to itself, so it's critical in a sense. But that connects us, I think. But there's one thing that you admitted, Mark, which is that when we met, I was practicing. I wasn't doing very much, but I was practicing. And I wasn't writing anything, and I wasn't really thinking very much. I was just making things one after another. And through Mark coming from a younger generation, to my surprise, they were reading books and being literate. That's the expose. And so the effect that he had on me was to, first of all, show me that the work that I was doing, one bloody thing after another, as they say about history, actually was an oeuvre. You know, it meant something, that there were ideas in it. And secondly, that it had values in it, and that by reading and looking at things outside architecture, like art or writing, which at that time was incredibly potent. You know, artists and writers on art were very important. By looking at those things, I could make my work stronger and better. So I've continued to make things in a rather more reflective way than I had been doing before I met Mark. But he did something very courageous, although he doesn't know it, because he was among the most talented designers of his generation. Those people like Peter St. John or Jonathan Wolff or those kinds of people. But he decided not to be an architect. Now that's a big step. That usually means the kind of end. You know, because if you want to be an architect here, you have to spend a very long time developing yourself and making yourself known and then differentiating yourself. But he didn't do that. He retrained as an artist and then became a writer and then became a photographer and then made things and then came back to being a designer with this very, very unique sensibility. And I've worked with a lot of interiorists, which I hate them. They're awful. They really are untrained and moronic, but when I work with Mark, it means something. there's intellectual content and social reality. So that was a courageous decision. And it meant that when you came to work at Delft, we had this program of practical professorships. I think we gave you an impractical professorship. We decided, I mean, usually what happens is practical professors appear and say, if you want to design a city, it goes like this. But he wrote a book, which was Without and Within. And so what happened is that in my teaching at Delft, he and Christoph Graffer, my associate professor, who some of you may know of, were the real critical milieu within which my activist sensibility could sit. So that's how come we can say that we've got parallel sensibilities, because both practices have gone in different directions. You know, I've moved from early work in the Listening Gallery, which was powerfully related to performance and a consciousness of bodiliness, to actually working in conventional architecture. And in the past, I had an interesting moment when I showed the Red House in Switzerland, I think, and people came up and they said, "We love the Listening Gallery, but you've become a neoclassicist." And I said, "Fuck off." No, I didn't say that. I said, actually, it's a development, you know. And so, without more ado, I'm going to show you what I do. I mean, this is interesting. I'm going to talk about the building that he's just spoken about, using the same images he's spoken about and saying different things. You've seen this one before. And but what I want to say, I'll talk about this urbanistically, and I'll talk about it as an object. On the left, there's a building which is awful. I mean, originally it was Whistler's studio, and then which was rather interesting by E.W. Godwin, which was pulled down by the impresario Colin Tennant, and he, like many members of the upper class, thought he could do things, like David Cameron thinks he can do things, and designed a house which was awful, and then a developer bought it and discovered that without the need for planning approval, he could reclad it in this sort of Renaissance style. So it's a monster. And actually, to put the cherry on the cake, while we were designing the Red House, Margaret Thatcher took an interest in buying it, so it would have been really a charged object, you know, Darth Vader living next door. So what does it mean? Well, if you, as I have said, take the view that as a designer, you accept that the things around you that influence your work and contextualize your work, if you take that view, then that building has to be very interesting. So it's architecturally very poor and culturally very interesting. And so the Red House makes a relationship with it, a very simple relationship with it, and the urbanistic gestures that I'll talk about are all simplistic. I mean, actually, I think urbanism is simplistic. And is there a problem in that? Not really. If you think of Solowit's sculptures and drawings that were made by instructions, if the gestures have a degree of intelligence, the outcome will be good. And so I hope that's the case here. So there's, I need to move to the screen, which means you probably won't be able to hear me unless I talk very loudly. This facade, part of the facade, aligns with that building, and the background aligns with the yellow building. So this was a kind of mistake in the development. The street, this rather beautiful street, well, actually it's not a beautiful street, it's a rather boring street, but this rather posh street was made in a typically English way, that developer after developer developed site after site. And we made this building which was different, but it also, through the fact that I look at things and notice things, it has scalar relationships with the buildings around it. It's also comfortable being seen in the oblique and not existing fully as a facade, and sometimes not being there at all. And Well, this is the stair by Mark, which actually I designed the lower bit, and he designed the handrail. I was going to do it in plastic, but it kind of got away from me. But the staircase is the one that Palladio would make using stone, which it's an inclined column, not a beam. I touched something, but I'm going to talk about it. Mark rather modestly forgot to say that he laid on his back like Michelangelo and painted that ceiling himself. But I designed the room, which is the dining room that projects into the garden, which can open on all sides, and which now after 10 years, or however many years it is, has a mature garden. So this is a place where, a house where you go from a London street into it, and you find something deeply exotic and quiet, and that's, I think, something worth doing. Here's in that room again. And again, Mark designed the ceiling. We had a question: how would we light the artworks without having an evident array of spotlights? Well, Mark's, I think actually it was a collaborative idea, was that there would be a ceiling that swoops, and you can see on your right, there's a slot behind there. It's absolutely jammed with lights, but this ceiling is a bit like a Italian painter, name forgotten, slashes canvases. Mark, help me here. Lucio Fontana, thank you very much. But I like Lucio Fontana, and actually the room, curiously, has lots of Italianate things in it. You know, it could be an small Italian palazzo that has an Italianate ceiling. And what I want to say is that by this stage in making this building, I'd become very interested in how you could make illusions and not complete them. You could make an architecture which had deeply familiar elements in it, but which didn't bring those familiar elements to a known conclusion. And I need to not be too long here, but what I'm going to say is that the house, when thinking about this house, what I want to say is that the modern movement in architecture was rather unable, for good reasons, unable to look at the architecture that went before it. That's not strictly true because Le Corbusier did, but Le Corbusier absorbed it so thoroughly that you wouldn't recognize it. But while Le Corbusier was working, Stravinsky was writing, and Picasso was painting, and Stravinsky was writing music, James Joyce was writing books, and all of those artists, all of those modern artists were completely at home with using motifs from the past. Right the String has Russian folk music in it. James Joyce uses the myth of Ulysses as a structuring device. Picasso was completely at home with the idea that Cubism was a continuation of this tradition. So it seems to me, and it's entirely possible, as I've attempted to in this house, that you can use emblems from the past in a building which is of today, and without falling into the snares of postmodernism, which I loathe and detest. So pick the bones out of that. And it's, the other thing is that it's a very large house, and so in a sense it's not a functionalist house. You know, each space doesn't have some assigned purpose. It's a bit like a palazzo in that the rooms invite uses, but their form comes from their outlook and views from them. I'm doing this at speed because otherwise it will be an hour and a half before I finish. Mark's bathroom, actually made by the people that, well anyway, it doesn't matter. Made by two very beautiful women, but we won't go there. And this is Mark's. Well, we've redone this bathroom several times, but we won't talk about that either. But what I want to say about this, Mark concluded with this image, but for me, what I wanted to achieve here was that the courtyard, the architecture of the courtyard obscured by planting, so that as you went from the bedroom into the bathroom and looked out, it was a dream world. You know, there wasn't any architecture intervening. But also in that dream world, you would see the city a little like the way that you see the city in the Listen Gallery, where it's disappointing and you're in a place of some luxury. I mean, you can make gated communities, you can ignore the world, but I don't want to. This is another project that it's an apartment building in Copenhagen. It's the one on the right. And, yeah, okay, joke. This was strange. We were visited by a very charming Danish person who said, would we like to work in Denmark? And staying very calm, but our hearts beating fast, said, yeah, quite possibly. And then he reappeared, and I said, what's the project? And he said, can't tell you. Then he reappeared, and he took some books away, and he reappeared, and he said, you're quite close to getting this project. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, there's a site in front of the marble church, that's the marble church, which has been vacant for 150 years, and we want to build in it. And it's not been possible to build in it because it wasn't developable. The owner of the site needed to make it a commercial building, and the city wanted it to be housing. But we, they said, as an architectural charity, have bought the site, and we want to finish the square that was built around the marble church. And the story of the marble church is that it was part of a larger development, started in about 1720 by King Christian, I don't know, 49th, whatever, and with a very beautiful octagonal piazza, which is worth a visit, with 4 large palazzi around it. And then that was to continued on axis to have ended in this church, surrounded by a piazza of apartments. But that stopped. After about 20 years, it stopped because kings didn't have ways of raising taxes, and they ran out of money. So later, a developer called Tikens offered to complete the development, finish the church on the basis that he could build at profit a square of apartments, which he did in this rather mediocre Beaux-Arts classical style. But he was never able to buy the site which we built on because the owners wouldn't sell it. So he couldn't finish the plaza. And plaza, the corner of the square became known as Tikens Agony. So it was a kind of strange cause célèbre in Copenhagen. And then schools of architecture set it as a project. And then a bunch of bloody foreigners came and finished it. It was us. So what did we do? Well, we were asked, on the basis of the Red House, to make a building which was a contemporary building and which could deal with the architecture around it. It could actually make it all work. And the first decision we made was that this would be, it wouldn't compete with the church. You know, it was a setting. This building is part of a setting. And so how do you make a building in that situation? Well, it struck me that the Beaux-Arts classicism, even in its weakest form, was very potent. It had been very potent. If you think of Barcelona or Paris or many other cities, they're made intensely habitable by Beaux-Arts classicism. Beaux-Arts classicism had the ability to both make internal spaces, building facades, and to make it the urbanistic, the spaces in between buildings. So it seemed to me that, you know, if you're on the basis of what I said about the Red House, if the past is available to you as a contemporary architect, then why not Beaux-Arts classicism? So this building that we made uses the motifs of the building on the right. That building on the right is the pavilion at the end of the square of Beaux-Arts apartments, and the church would be in the foreground here. So it uses the fact that it has a 3-part division. It uses the fact that there are pilasters. It says that the pilasters, however, this being a building after modernism, the pilasters have to be the structure. It has windows, but our building, the windows go from pier to pier and are very generous. The attic, which in the original building would have been a place for storage and for servants, in our building becomes a designed penthouse. So in a way, that starting point of Beaux-Arts classicism became a kind of curious critique of modernism, or an observation of modernism. So from the church side, you get this facade, and this, as you see on the left, these were some buildings which predated the square and couldn't be demolished. And so I hope that in reducing this building's facade to its structure, it would have some of the constructivist qualities of the older building on the left, and also some of its more prismatic qualities. But that building on the left had an informal roof garden on it, an illegal roof garden. And what struck me was that the square as a whole had become something. It had changed from the original intention, which would be Beaux-Arts apartments. You know, when you look in the windows, there are dentists' surgeries, there's graphic artists. So this building has roof gardens or loggias on the side. And to make this short, the intention was to complete this square, not in terms of how it began, but in terms of what it had become. And I'm not going to talk about more of this, otherwise I'll be too late, except to say that in the apartments, you really are in the city. To our immense surprise, we were selected to build an embassy, and I almost didn't get the job of having gone to the security clearance, and they said, "Did you take drugs and were you a member of political parties in the 60s? And I said, yes, but we kind of managed to scrape through that one. And the officer that interrogated me said, "At the end of this, I'm going to have to ask you a question." And I thought, I wonder what that will be. And at the end of it, he said, "I've just started going out with somebody else, and their daughter wants to be an architect. How do you do it?" And I thought, oh. So I said, I'll get back to you. Anyway, here we are designing the embassy. In fact, we designed one, and then it was abandoned because the precursors to ISIS bombed the British embassy in Turkey, in Istanbul. And then, anyway, so to cut a long story, to make a long story even longer, we ended up building just the chancellery. Chancellery is the office space of an embassy. Now this, in an embassy you have a particular issue, which is that you have to make a blast-proof facade, and so that if somebody decides to ride a vehicle bomb to it, you have to, first of all, you have to keep them away, which is what those bollards do. Then you have to stop them from climbing over the fence. And then if the bomb explodes, the facade has to protect the people inside it. But the other issue that we had was that in Warsaw, the temperature variance is quite high. I mean, it's 25, let's say, in summer and minus 18 in the winter. So one could have put, and it faces due south, just to make life completely impossible. And where am I? What was I going to say? Hang on. Yeah, it's coming back to me. So the obvious answer, well, the thing is that embassies don't maintain themselves, you know, because being government departments, they're all starved of money. So we made what's called a climate facade, which you as practicing architecture students would know all about, wouldn't you? It's a double facade with a space between it where in the winter you close it, it acts as a thermos flask, in the summer you open it and it exhausts hot air. So it meant that we could have, well, here's another aspect. We were surprised to find that the Foreign Office didn't have a sort of apparatchik who would say, no, if you're going to design an embassy, son, it's got to look like this. Interestingly, they said, no, you're a designer, just make a contemporary statement that represents the UK. So that was an incredibly open brief. So what did we do? Well, I wanted a building which reflected the sky and trees, romantic that I am, but also that showed, move to the next slide, that within inside there was a building which really meant business, and the blast facade is inside. I mean, the double glazed units are incredibly heavy. This whole facade was made by an Austrian company that make bank screens. And when you design embassies, you can't put more highly secure elements over less highly secure, so you end up with this shape, you know, and it means you get a garden each side on the roof, and that's the garden which is for the staff. And the other side there's a garden I haven't got photographs of, where the ambassador can walk and talk with those friends of freedom like Saddam Hussein or Kambili-Yong. So we aim to help. In the working space, it's very, very quiet because that double facade makes it quiet. And in the middle of the plan is a blast-proof garden. Here we are. And of course, there needs to be a portico so that when the Queen arrives, she won't get a perm wet, you know. or when ambassadors arrive, and it has, it needs identity, so it has the coat of arms in it, which, when the doors open inadvertently, Scotland goes in one direction and England in the other. But that was a kind of, but it's romantic, and it's at night. Well, come on, you know what I'm talking about. When you come into an embassy, you can't really drive into it unless you're an ambassador. You drive in, and your car is checked, and you go to a garage. But really, the most terrible part of embassies is the consular and visa section, which is always around the back, always poorly designed. But here we thought, no, let's hear it for the ordinary man. And so when you come in, you walk past on the other side of that glass screen, and you see all of the front garden, you see all of the embassy, and then you go around the back, and there's an entrance for you. There's an entrance for consular and visa people, which is just as elegant and just as worthwhile. Having said that, life changes. They now do all their visas by internet, so this is probably it's probably the cleaner's entrance now. Stuff happens. I decided I'd group civic buildings together, and so this is a project we're building now in Deense in Belgium, and it's the river is on the left, and then the church below, and then what we're building, the Hotel de Ville, the council chamber and offices is there, and it's a low-energy building. It has shading through these loges on both the sides, and most interestingly, it has the council chamber, which is visible, publicly visible, and that's a big plus for them. They actually want their democratic processes to be visible, and it's made of stone cast into concrete, and I'll just show you what it looks like. This is the staff canteen, so you can see, from in it, you can see the city over which you have responsibility, and if you're in the council chamber, also you see that. So there's a kind of contact which has been essential in the way that I've been working for a long time, and then low energy offices which have exposed concrete ceilings, opening windows, and the loges provide a space outside the workspace which is informal, where you can smoke or sit or have a meeting. So there's something I think more liberating about having an outside space outside a workspace. A workspace usually has a confinement that is you forget, but actually oppresses you. We had a stream of work in Denmark, and we won this competition, which is now realised. A museum about 2.5 hours south of Copenhagen, in an area called Fuglsang, which means bird song. On this site, which is this is before the building was made, and the building has been situated to the right of the picture, but it's classic Danish rurality, and you can see up on the other side there's a manor house. I wonder if I got a photograph of it. Yeah, it's this, which is sort of country classicism, and each of the rooms has a slightly different decor. It's been done over a period of time, so it has a sort of inequality, which I like very much. But the most striking aspect of the project was the view out from that farmyard that I showed you, over flat land, into a salt marsh and into the sea. And I've worked in Holland, and that's pretty flat. This is transcendentally flat. So our building sits looking out onto that landscape, an abstract object, but as you approach it, the view is taken away, and you find yourself coming into the entrance and then into the cafe, and at the back of the cafe there's a view into an apple orchard, and this is a device that works to orientate you. You see the landscape, and then it's taken away, and then it's represented in different ways, and it seems to me that although this is a small museum, those top-lit spaces that are endemic to museums can always do with outlook from within them. So in the middle of the space there's a gallery, long gallery, which connects all of the exhibition spaces, and on one side a temporary exhibition space which has, the daylighting is variable. As you can see, it can be darkened down, so if you need if you have video and film, you can have it on one end and painting in the other. So it's an adaptable space. And then at the other end is less adaptable space. Because what I neglected to say is that the collection is a permanent one, and it's Danish painting from in all of the styles, Provincialism, Golden Age, and none of it's particularly good, but actually it's very relevant locally. And on the other side of that corridor are rooms which were designed much more decoratively and enfilade for paintings of gold frames, small scale. And what you can see in the ceiling is the roof line, one of the roof lights, which may be observed in the facade, which brings light to the floor but not on the walls. So you can have conservation light levels on the paintings, but an effective daylight in the room. And at the end of that enfilade is a plaster cast room, which, because it's not light sensitive, you get a view of the landscape, and then you go back into the corridor, and then you find yourself in a room at the end where, for the client's wish, according to the client's wish, and very successfully, it's a room where you just sit and look at the landscape. And then that building, when you see it from a distance from the sea, you can see it has an abstract quality which is at home with the abstract quality of the barn. In a similar way to the relationship in Fuglsang, you know, that the vernacular architecture and contemporary architecture talk to each other. We finished this project recently, and it shows you the scale of difference between the work outside the UK and here. This is a small cafe attached to Tower Bridge, which we won in a curious competition. What do you do if you do something like this? Well, if you look at the buildings that are on the quay side around the Tower of London, they adopt two stylistic positions. If it's the entrance building, it says, the style of the building says, I'm high-tech like those office buildings across the road, and I've got absolutely nothing to do with the Tower of London. The other iteration is the food booths and things like that, which say, I'm just a brown garden shed and I'm invisible, but I didn't want to do anything like that. I wanted to make a building which actually worked formally with the Tower of London, and which also had some of the playfulness of early Frank Gehry. So it may be specious, but what it isn't, it was intentional. The main part, there's four parts of the building. There's the terrace outside, an eating place, and then continuous with it, a lower eating place, which goes under the bridge. So the larger part in the middle is like one of the towers of London turned upside down, you know, so it's battlements rhyme. So in a way that's not particularly obvious, it has a rhyming relationship with the Tower of London. Its coloration, through being thinly painted white wood, its coloration is lightly used with the stone in the Tower of London. And it's one that works plastically. You know, it's a place past which people will walk, and so their tactile experience is enhanced by it. But inside, it's unashamedly romantic. There aren't many places on the quayside where you can sit and actually look at Tower Bridge and all of its Victorian vulgarity, but here you can, including the candle on the table, which is what restaurateurs do. But you can also look back at the Tower of London. This place is open in the night, so it's not simply a tourist restaurant. And here it is. It's from this perspective, it's the same size as the Shard. Anyway, I digress. You know. But yeah, okay, move on. This the terrace. If you want to extend the eating season, you have to give some cover. This framework supports blinds, so that when it rains, you can sit outside. But it means that actually, you know, what I learned about architecture is that your eye is always working. And my eye was working, I think, to see a relationship between that framework and Tower Bridge. And so, in a way, there's another rhyming relationship. And it's another place where you can sit and you can see this wonderful and vulgar object. In Amsterdam, we've made quite a lot of work in Holland. This is a quite particular housing scheme in Amsterdam, made for a housing association. And housing associations in Holland built rentable housing and speculated on the market. And this is part of a small urban design of 3 buildings, each having to have a pair of buildings with a private courtyard in the middle, and each having to have a glass screen to keep that courtyard free from road noise. And so it's a building also which is a loft. You know, it has a high degree of redundancy on the south facade. Wherever you put a partition, you'll have a balcony. And it's a building which I was interested in buildings of Chicago from the turn of the century, where they're rather sober, and yet as you look at them more and more, you see that there are details which have emerged, you imagine, in order to solve problems. And this is a building which repays casual looking and re-looking. So let's look at its inside. Inside, you enter the loft spaces through this walkway, and there are moments. What I've learned is that you can start with an extremely simple premise, and it will always deliver something. So when you walk up the stair from the ground floor to that space that I showed you, those walkways, you get this moment of contrast. And then when you stand on the front, you see this large tree structure against Amsterdam. And when you are in your penthouse, you see the city reflected. But it's a community. It is a community, and it has apartments like this, which are, you rent these spaces and you fit them out. And this one has been fitted out as a rather comfortable bourgeois apartment. This one by 2 young men couple who are hairdressers, I think, who have a rather, let's say, as I understand it, the bed base can be removed and they can have a disco at night. Only in Amsterdam could you do that. And then there's a Polish dentist, and Carol, the hairdresser, who works from there. And but it's an urban place, a bit like the Tietjensgrond in Copenhagen. It's a place not for everybody, but it's a place for certain people who like to be in the city. Final project, I believe, we're doing actually a lot of work in Belgium, and this is Antwerp, a view of Antwerp from the developer's office, and you will see the red building, which is the Museum aan de Stroom by Neckinger Mills, the Dutch practice. And then you can see it in the background, just to situate you. That area of Quay is where we're building. And those first 2 buildings had already been made by Dina and Dina, and then there'll be 2 more. 2 more are being built by David Chipperfield's, according to plans by David Chipperfield's office, and then we get the other ones. Now, the story is that a bit like the house next to the Red House, you know, it's an intriguing story. The original developer, who was a very sophisticated Flemish developer, had to sell the site in the middle. So you notice that David's scheme on the left has got ample and handsome balconies, and the one on the right hasn't got any, because the developer who bought the project was really cheap, you know. And so David got a lower budget, and then we got a really low budget. And we said to the developers, so we'd like to make a building like David Chipperfield in white concrete. You know, we'd like to be grown up. And they said, forget it. And we said, so what are we going to build in? And they said, well, brick. And we said, 16 floors high. And they said, yeah. And we said, are you going to prefabricate it? No. Well, what are you going to do? Well, we just send bricklayers out there and build it. And we thought, oh, come on. And then we looked around Antwerp, and it's full of Portuguese bricklayers, you know, up on scaffold buildings. So okay, you know, we made a scheme where, what do you do with the tower? I mean, what do you do with the tower? Actually, it's incredibly limited what you can do with the tower on a small budget. We're not talking about a Seagram building here. So our pitch was to make one building have vertical emphasis, the one right at the end, which looks out to the water, and the other one would have a horizontal emphasis with brick. Got it. And so you can't climb up the brick when you're drunk. It stops about 2 meters above the floor, but actually it looks a bit like Star Trek. And the other one, this is really ugly. You know, I really like this one. This was a real problem. If you want to not have a corner and the engineers pointed too late, you end up with a beam like that. But actually, see, what I really like is this way of working where you start with a format and then you let things happen to it. You know, you probably might begin to notice that some of the balconies are longer than others, and you know what I'm talking about, don't you? If you don't, too late. This is the real estate agent's renderings. Actually, it's a fantastic rendering. This is only a bit of it, but actually the detail's amazing. I'm going to hire these renderers, I think. I'm going to hire them. I'm going to find out where they are. I'm going to hire them. But the one that we did at the end has got a crown. You know, it's unashamedly kit. It's got a crown made of gold expanded mesh with lights behind it. Well, it does have lights behind it now, but you can't believe the amount of struggle we had to get the developer to pay for the lights. But anyway, I think that's the end. Yes, it is the end. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both so much. Let's take a few questions, and let me, as you settle your things. No, please have a seat. You've been standing for a bit. I think you've earned it. Thank you for a kind of dazzling and right at the edge of understated British humor, working right under the surface for the last hour. Fantastic. Sorry? Yeah. Just for the whole audience to appreciate that alone as a kind of feature of the presentation of the argument. I had two questions for you, and then I know it's going to be a room with lots of questions, so I want to get quickly to those. First one is I was wondering in this, you know, at a certain level, your assertion of the cultural project that underlies not just the collaborative things you've done, but also your own individual works. You know, one of the key ways you do that is, of course, by crossing over deliberately between architecture and art in distinct fields like the interior designer as a kind of role, and demanding that those be brought together in a larger project. And that made me wonder the question of if we were to have extended the invitation tonight, have you over the course of your careers found other key collaborators or disciplines or fields, in fact, that you can imagine have been part of this larger conversation?
We've never slept with anybody else.
I'm wondering if, for example, builders or fabricators or it might be landscape, for example, but are there other fields that you could say is also playing a part of the conversation?
I think both of us have worked with people of like minds or sensibilities or surprising people. Nick Haneke, a very great structural engineer, for example. I work often with other architects, Sturgis and Bates, East, Tony, in order to, because there's a conversation that is going on, which has been open and generous and searching for a very long time. And I think the essence of our interest in these other areas of practice were that they were not afraid of engaging with ideas, and that we simply wanted to make work which had ideas. And so it was very natural for us to, first of all, speak to each other. It was very natural for us to incorporate the thoughts and the criticality inherent to these other practices, and very natural for us to engage as necessary with other people. I will say that, it's not just Tony and I who've shared lots of conversations, but it should be noted that Jonathan Surgison very wonderfully hosted events at his house on Sunday mornings for I don't know, a year and a half, where a number of people in this room, including, well, it was Jonathan and Tony and Peter, you and I, and here today we're here for some conversations, Jonathan Wolfe, Bradley Core, and so on, really wanted to fracture the assumptions of each of our practices in front of each other. And the essence of those conversations is that we felt it absolutely necessary to make architecture or art which made this culture see itself for whatever that meant. So there are lots of people who could join this table, some of them who are here tonight, so if they want to come up, sure.
Oh, okay, me. Well, actually, yeah, I mean, I work with like-minded other professionals. You can't really work with, unless you have people who share something of your sensibility. But the big place for me where things happened after that moment I described with Mark was at Delft, where we had a department of really bright minds. And what I had to learn was to go from being a self-centered artist to being a tolerant leader of people. And that was great. That was great. I mean, it was made easier by the fact that that the Netherlands has a sort of collectivized attitude, but that really made me happy, and I miss it. I miss it very much. I tried to get some of it in CAS with the other teachers I care for, Stephen Taylor among them, but the school structure at CAS is very limited. You know, we don't have faculty meetings. We don't have the things that we used to have. We used to have every 6 months we had a whole day policy discussion with all of the faculty, and the results were fantastic. You know, the teachers who actually taught would speak, Mark would speak. It was a real confluence of thinkers and teachers, and I think every 2 weeks we had a faculty discussion. We're trying to do that at UEL, where I'm visiting professor, but boy, they're so busy. They haven't got any time to talk. And that's what happened at Delft. You know, the Dutch government, in its foolishness, decided to extract teaching time, and we couldn't have those meetings. We did have them, but they weren't very productive. But also worse, everybody's research time was used up. And CAS has got that problem. It hasn't got any space at all to talk. And they're very, very good, UEL have got very, very good people in it, very committed people. So I've started faculty meetings, but the people just don't have the time to have them, you know. So that's a story of ashes in a way. But that's where collaboration counted for me.
The other question, just one other question I thought before handing it across, which I kept trying to imagine. I mean, in a way, the last hour you could say is a sort of record of stunning achievements and accomplishments, which always then makes me want to imagine, have the two of you thought about projects that you haven't yet gotten to? What would be an ideal brief? What would be a kind of project that you feel like would be an interesting twist on either the ideas that have been passing between the two of you, or simply that the studios haven't seen yet brought forward?
All those competitions that we did in our early career that was so sparkling before we had to deal with the business of doing things, which takes the edge off of form and makes you pragmatic and clever by necessity. All of those early projects were the things that we should have done. But now we're living in a different world. You know, you have to succeed and produce things in that world. You can't just say it's over. So the answer is, I don't know. The next project. I've given up. Ever since I got my fingers burnt at the V&A, where we were horse whispered and then lost. You know, I can't do it. I can't do all that bullshit. I just build bits of cities. You know, that's what was happening in Amsterdam. I just built a bit of a city, just ordinary stuff. Good general practice, you know. I'm very, very against the way that architecture and the theory of architecture was commodified in the last 30 years. I won't be part of it. I'll do this. I'll build bits of cities. So, to not answer your question. What do you want to say?
No, I want to, if there are any questions from
Yeah, let's open it up to the audience. Irene?
If it's Irene, it'll be difficult.
No, it won't be difficult, I promise. As one gets older, one gets simpler, I think.
Okay, steady.
It's from the beginning of your collaboration to to the present. And of course, I was very close to both of you at the beginning. And that's about 25 years. It's a long time. Yeah. And one has a different personality, of course, as a young, budding architect or artist.
I'm still young and budding.
And
I was always old.
And then, as Tony, you have said, I mean, there are certain pressures which come to, in practice, and in the conversation which I remember in the, 25 years ago, figures which were discussed were people, but of course not only, but like Hannes Meyer and like Martstam and so on. There was a kind of radical edge, I hesitate to use the word radical, but still there was something quite brash and direct and keen, which you have alluded to when you answered Brett's question. I would like to ask you, how do you see the transformation of your work with this passing of time and having to deal with the exigencies of practice and the kind of, whether you feel actually rewarded and satisfied, or whether, as I think you touched on, Tony, that there is a certain frustration that these very early projects which were full of content and full of, very, very personally invested, and that's the same with you, Mark. I would like you to reflect on that, about what has happened in the last 20 years and how this has impacted on your work.
Well, I built 1 of 5, which is the Listening Gallery. That wasn't bad. I got a result there, which is unusual. You've got to live. You've got to accept the way that life is. You can't. You have to constantly adjust to what you find, and you have to get a result. You have to get the best possible result you can at any time. And it means that the things that I would have said 25 years ago, I wouldn't say now, because I know they wouldn't be realizable. If you can do it well, instead of immediacy, which the earlier projects had, you get longevity. You get durée, if you do it well. What do you think? Figure that one out. You're speechless. This is the first time I've... Say that again. Careful.
It's a question I want to answer, because it's not for me to answer the questions tonight, but Mark, also I would like you to say something about how you actually see the work which was done in the very early days. And I must say it was very, very nice to see some of those works which you did with Peter, and which actually I had not seen at the time.
Yeah.
And how do you reflect yourself on the passing of time, not necessarily in relation to what you have done afterwards, but about this work having been done then, and about what has happened?
I think, well, first of all, the frustration of not being able to realize things with through a certain medium at a certain time, partly directed me in changing my practice in the way I did. But something I feel as if I had an idea of what I was supposed to do quite early, and that I've been fumbling towards a position of knowing more and more what that is. I think circumstances have dictated that for one reason or another, it only happens occasionally where things are able to come into focus. This is just to do with the accidents of commissions and the loss of commissions and so on. But in a sense, I don't feel as if I mean, at the time that you're talking about, it was, and it was really something I noted as I was putting slides together in the wrong order, that which you saw tonight. There was a lot of simultaneous production. You know, things which seemed to be across different disciplines, all happening at the same time. One was extremely productive, and you know, one knew what one was trying to say, and it had to be, it could be said in these different media. Conversations were extremely intense. Ambitions were focused. I'd say they weren't desires to do amazing things, but actually to speak in a certain way. I feel what has happened, and there's an aspect of regret to what hasn't happened, of course, but I feel what has happened through writing is that I have become much more articulate about what this position is in fact, and where it comes from, and what its implications are for people who were not myself, and namely energy, or that idea as it's transmitted to students. Teaching is very, very important for me, not because it sustains my personality, but I really think it's my responsibility to help students find their voice in perhaps the way I found my voice quite early. Hopefully they can sustain careers which make a difference. So I do not feel separated from any of the things that we were discussing and making at that time. In fact, you know, it's one of the terrible things about 25 years passing. First of all, things accumulate. You know, you end up with a lot of things done and things said because all these years have passed. But you also have you can have a very, very strong connection to things you said or thought 25 years ago, as if you're still thinking them, still in the process of thinking them out. So this is very much the case with me, and that's why I said I'm still a budding youth. I'm hoping that before all the buds fall off, I'll be able to realize some more potent works.
But Leverins, when he was 90, was full of ideas. A friend of mine who was a stagiaire in an office which helped Leverins with his projects said that Leverins got ill when he was 90 and then recovered. So everybody thought he was going to die, and then being 90, he wasn't attracting many commissions. So he did two things. He did a competition for, I think, the Swedish Parliament, which was 3 triangular towers, and it was an anonymous competition. And this very considerable architect, the jury took special time out to say how stupid and ineffective and bad it was. And I think Leverins just smiled. At a certain stage, you do what's in you, And late work is often, not that I'm doing late work, I hope, but somebody like Leverins' work it's very mysterious. And so it takes a long time to be an architect, I'm afraid. That's the bad news. And rails against it, but it takes a long time to be an architect. It's the worst economic model you could ever think of. It really makes no sense. But you can make it work. Are there any other questions before we go off to dinner? He hinted. Come on, Santi, you can ask a question.
Mark, how important is humor in your work?
Well, that's funny.
How important is humor?
Humor in my that's an interesting one. I can be quite funny. but
we could get him to imitate.
No, I'm not going to imitate any of the people in this room, but although it is possible. I think there's only kind of simile and metaphor and that kind of thing in my work. That's not very funny. Although I find that photography is an incredible outlet for humor, and that placing things together on one picture plane as you can with photographs, things which don't belong together, I've done, even in my most serious, supposedly objective topographic photography. I'm very sorry that I don't have a photograph of Indian Queens in Cornwall with its amazing Wild West town and plastic horses, but what can you do?
I have to ask a question, I will. Guys, what do you want to be remembered for? Give 1 to 3 things that you want to be remembered for.
I don't care about being remembered. I really don't care about being remembered. And you know what? It's working. Here is this person at the front of the room. Mark, what are you going to be remembered for?
I remember this question came up in this conference that we were doing about 10 years ago. And I was, no, you and I, it was at the TU. And I was showing La Scala, and I was talking about it, you know, just disappearing into this landscape. And that was the idea, that in fact I wanted to make work where I wasn't present, and the work was just assumed by people, and it became part of something which will be there or not in years' time. And this Dutch artist who we had at the event just couldn't believe it, you know. Dutch artists tend to be pretty ambitious, you know. No, it was a lady. It was a lady, in fact. But she said that, no, you're full of shit, you know, that can't be. But it is genuinely the case that I do want to disappear and let what the work does, I've forgotten how to say it. Make the work work. That's far more important. So, you know, I'm very, very pleased, for example, with the BBC thing, which was a bit of a weird commission because, as usual, you go in with a very beautiful idea, which was, in fact, the whole space was supposed to be a fragment of a globe, but very, very slight, so that your sense of your body changed as you walked across it. Within about 5 minutes, they said, well, how about it flat? And they said, and then, you know, it's just like that. But what it became was something that people took on and possessed and liked very much. Even the Queen liked it.
There's a W.H. Auden, who's a poet I particularly like, said that in one of his poems, that for him, and I'm misquoting him, for him, the Albert Memorial, St. Paul's, and the Acropolis were made by the same very old anonymous old man. You know, it's all right. I don't mind that. You know, anonymity as an architect is nobody knows who you are. There's a story of somebody saying, "So, Mr. Foster, what do you do for a living?" You know, it happens. It's all right. Actually, it's good. Anonymity is good. All those people that are famous, they have a very difficult life because they're on this tightrope and they can fall off and they're finished. We can fall off the tightrope and get back on it. It's really great.
Guys,
Which
thank
we
you
just
very
did.
much. Thanks so much.